Hey guys, Ex-Peon here, and today we are talking about D&D's missing ability scores, or the certain gaps of the core 6 ability scores that could be filled by new ability scores. So, of course, the core 6 ability scores being Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma. They're a classic for a reason, I'm not knocking them, but they do have some missing gaps, so let's talk about it. So, Strength, of course, we all know what Strength is. And it's a pretty good one. There's not really too many gaps with strength, though there is kind of the distinction between forms of strength, because there's the strength it takes to say lift up a rock or swing a sword, but there is also kind of a bit of a gray area when it comes to speed. For example, 5e has athletics as a skill, which relates to running and jumping, that type of thing, and that's not really something covered by dexterity. I mean, you might kind of think it is, but it really isn't. So that's kind of a gray area. So I think there could be another skill, which could be something like speed, or I guess you could call it athleticism, but I think something like speed would work. Because in the history of D&D, there's been different attempts to kind of sort of have speed be sort of like a class feature or just a feature of how much equipment you're carrying, but it really is kind of a gap that could be filled by something else, as in a new ability score that covers speed. It could be called adroitness if you wanted to make it Gygaxian. But so, for example, with 5e, monks, they get faster over time. They just literally get faster, and they also gain the ability to make more attacks, which is sort of a function of speed. But and they kind of covered for it that way by having it be a class and level feature. But it easily could be just an ability score, because speed is innate. Some people are just naturally fast, though of course that's something you can develop, but there's still a very strong sort of natural or genetic quality to speed. And there's a lot of gameplay areas where speed could really be a good feature. For example, how fast you can move, potentially even how many attacks you can make, but also how fast you act in initiative, because how fast you act, or your initiative is kind of generally covered by dexterity. But that's if you know the definition of dexterity, that doesn't really make the most sense, and that could easily make a lot more sense being covered by speed. Just moving faster, maybe attacking faster, attacking slightly more often or a bit more often, and just generally that. So that's kind of what I would say for speed. I'd say that's definitely a missing ability score that could be added that could kind of round out the ability scores a bit more. So moving on to dexterity, we tend to think of dexterity as agility, anything from kind of picking a lock to juggling to dodging an arrow to just kind of like breaking, even like breaking a fall and going into a roll instead of just splatting on the ground. And sneaking around. We think of all sorts of things being covered by dexterity, but really, we've really expanded the definition of dexterity. Most definitions of dexterity just have it relate to like manual dexterity, like the ability to manipulate things well with your hands, which does apply to lockpicking. And there's also the connotation of like mental dexterity, but that's a whole other topic. But I think dexterity was just kind of chosen, maybe from a thesaurus by Gary Gygax when D&D was first made, and in the original edition, it didn't even really do much. This was before Thieves came around, so literally all it did was modify your missile accuracy by plus or minus one. So going off of that, I don't think a ton of thought was put into dexterity, honestly. So for me, I don't think dexterity really makes the most sense as an ability score. Maybe I would replace it with agility, or maybe that wouldn't be necessary if speed was added as an ability score. You could still have dexterity relate to things like picking locks and throwing daggers and that type of thing. But then you could have speed relate to things like initiative, movement speed, potentially even armor class, though that might be a little bit too radical. But dexterity really does not really mean just overall agility and dodginess and quickness, but I think we've just kind of assumed, because there's no other ability score that even relates to that. I think we've kind of over time just kind of assumed more and more what dexterity means, but I think it's definitely gone well past the actual definition of dexterity. So Constitution, most definitions of Constitution really relate to like health or vitality, sort of like the ability to get sick and or not get sick, or if you do get sick, recover quickly. There's the old idiom about strength is how hard you can throw a tomato, dexterity is how well you can dodge a tomato. It actually makes sense for Constitution because that's how well you can eat a rotten tomato and not get sick. The problem is though, is that doesn't really relate to hit points that well. It could relate to hit point recovery actually pretty well, but just outright hit points, like being generally able to bounce back from illness and just that type of thing, that doesn't really directly translate to having more hit points as in being able to get hit more. And we tend to think of Constitution as that kind of like healthiness, but also in large part like toughness. So I think it could make sense to just kind of replace Constitution with toughness, or maybe a slightly more fancy or elaborate term, but just that kind of thing. Because if you're just going off the actual definitions, then Constitution just doesn't really apply to getting hit by an axe. Though it probably would apply to how well you can recover from getting hit by an axe, but that's another story. So intelligence, I think the main problem with intelligence and also wisdom is just that they cover so much ground together and they really overlap each other. So honestly, I think you could probably just replace wisdom, like remove wisdom, and you'd get rid of all that gray area. And then anything that, I guess involves your noggin, involves knowledge or understanding, using your brain, which applies to basically anything, could be under intelligence. And I think that is kind of a small issue with intelligence, which is that it could reasonably apply to everything, to the extent that it doesn't really apply to almost anything in D&D. Because, if you have like a swordsman who's a genius, he should have a big leg up over another swordsman who's, the same amount of strength and dexterity and whatnot, but isn't nearly as intelligent. Like, there should be a big difference there. But, you can't model everything, so that's not the end of the world. So intelligence is fine. I think it's really only made blurry by wisdom. And wisdom, I would just replace it with something like perception, just because, that is important, like the ability to perceive things using your senses and to kind of understand the world that way. And having perception be a skill that's governed by the amorphous wisdom is just, it doesn't really make the most sense. It doesn't really mean that much, because I don't think your ability to perceive things is a super trainable thing. I think it's more accurately just something that you kind of innately have. Like myself, I have really low innate perception. Like, I could be looking for my keys with them on the table and just not see them, even if I look around for like 2 minutes. Like, and I just have a low perception, but I don't think I have a low wisdom. So that's my opinion, that wisdom should probably be replaced by perception. And then you have charisma. I think charisma is basically fine. I don't think there's really anything to say about it. I think whatever the social ability score is, I do think it needs to be vague enough that it can apply to leadership, to charm, to persuasion, to rhetoric, to intimidation, just all sorts of ways of interacting with people. And I think charisma, at least in the classic sense, I guess we think of charisma today as riz, or maybe just generally like being charming. But so I don't know if charisma maybe is quite the right term to really encompass just every aspect of sociality. Maybe I would replace it with like influence or something like that, just your ability to influence people. But charisma is probably fine. So those are my opinions. I guess my main opinions is that speed is a really big missing ability score that over time, I guess across the editions of D&D has tried to be covered just with like item weight and class features and that type of thing. That speed being added as an ability score would really, I think, add to the game. And because think about it, like if you're playing 5e and you have to resolve like two people running for the same thing, and they're both kind of generic, so like they both have like the generic 30 feet per round movement. I guess maybe you'd make an athletics check, but that's still just not very satisfactory. Most strength-based characters are going to have athletics as a skill. Let's be real, because that's the only strength skill in 5e. And plus, I don't know, there is a distinction between like a powerlifter and a sprinter. Like, they both have to be strong, but, one has to train a very specific kind of strength. Well, the other, it's different. So, I don't know if that's something that comes up all the time, but I legitimately think speed or alacrity, whatever you want to call it, would be a valuable ability score. And I think perception would be useful as an ability score also. Maybe not quite as, maybe it wouldn't be filling quite as big of a gap, but I think that'd be valuable. And perhaps charisma could be, perhaps constitution and charisma could be redefined to kind of cover what they're supposed to cover a little bit more accurately. And wisdom could be removed, but those are a bit more minor. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Do you think D&D has any missing ability scores? What would you add in? So yeah, just let me know. Thank you for watching, and as always, XP on.